Jeff, it's so great to meet you. I've been excited to do this interview. I have been enjoying your book, Good Stress. Congratulations. The health benefits of doing hard things, good stress. And it really appealed to me because we're definitely in an age where people are being given all kinds of tips about how to remove discomfort from their life. But really, it's good for us. And you really tackle this beautifully in your book. And I'm excited to talk to you about lots of stuff. In fact, there was so much stuff I had to discipline myself to knock it down to a few things. So welcome and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, such a treat to be with you. And I really value this opportunity, both to connect with you, but with also the incredible community that you've been building over the number of years. So thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, Jeff, let's start off with a little bit about, let's dive straight in. The book is called Good Stress. So let's dive straight into, let's define stress because as you and I both know, I mean, I catch myself saying it, "Oh, I'm so stressed." Then I have to stop myself saying, hey, hang on, which kind of stress am I in? It's actually good for me. How can I use this? But it's so commonly thrown out there. And I think people sort of understand, but I don't think they have the best understanding of what stress is. So could we begin by defining that, the different types of stress?
Yeah, well, most denizens of modernity have a very negative association with stress, as you point out. And that's completely justifiable because stress in modern life is often chronic, right? So it never goes away and it leads to all sorts of imbalances in the body that then we dub as disease. But when we really excavate the nature of stress, at the core, it's an adaptive physiological response. And so I'll just try to ground this in an example so people can really grok it. So I'm an avid hiker. I live up in the hills of the Santa Monica Hills. And from time to time I will come across a rattlesnake on the path, for example. And I will have a
Scary.
bottom, yeah, scary for a moment. I'll have an involuntary bottom up response to that phenomenon, that experience, where my heart rate and my respiratory rate will start to increase. My liver will, produce just the right amount of glucose that'll send to my extremities to fight or flee. My pupils might dilate, the aperture of my attention may become very narrow. I'll become very self-obsessed and distrust the world around me for very, very good reason because I'm satisfying my biological imperative to survive. I want to live. But pretty soon that rattlesnake will eye me and I will disappear from his specials menu probably, and he'll slither off into the high grasses. And what will happen? Well, my body will return to homeostasis. My heart rate and respiratory rate will decrease. The aperture of my attention will open back up. I'll become more creative and trusting of the world around me. And that is a very, very adaptive response to stress. And the body is riddled with these adaptive responses to the right dosage of stress. The problem in modern society is for so many people, the rattlesnake never leaves the metaphorical path, right? So then we are in this state of constant chronic stress with all of the concomitant stress hormones, et cetera, that undermine health. But when you really, really look at how we evolved as Homo sapiens and for hundreds of thousands of years and for millions of years of our hominid ancestors, we evolved in relationship to Paleolithic stressors that were actually adaptive for the human body. And there's so many of them that, we could unpack, but calorie paucity, for example, or exposure to fluctuations in temperature, immersion in nature, even living in community. These were the conditions that we evolved in for 99.9% of our experience here on Earth. And the modern age has essentially stripped away, in many cases, those Paleolithic stressors in the name of convenience and ease. And
Mhm.
it's creating a whole panoply of evolutionary mismatches that are leading to these conditions or chronic diseases that have become epidemic level now.
That's such a great explanation, and it's true. It's that chronic stress is the thing that's the problem. 'Cause stress is actually good for us, as you said. We need that as an
Mhm.
adaptive response. I love that, and you. This was a question I was going to ask further down, but it makes sense to ask it now. I love how you handle epigenetics, which is becoming very trendy. I spoke about it like 30 years ago, and it was what? Now
Yeah.
people are really, but you have a wonderful way of explaining it, and I think what you've just said is has highlighted that our environment is epigenetics and it influences how our genes express themselves. So, in terms of stress, could you just talk a little bit about epigenetics and how it's not just our genes, but it's our environment that's actually activating those genes and switching them on and off? And you explained that beautifully and potentially, but just as you've set up the example already so beautifully, and maybe just explain a little bit about methylation because I know that that's something that people hear, but not everyone understands, and it's very significant. And you talk about it very nicely in the book.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for the better part of the 20th century, we really subscribed to genetic determinism. And of course, the discovery of DNA and the structure of DNA in the early 1950s by Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin was incredible. But we became essentially obsessed with this notion that we could map the human genome and really peg disease and behavior to these underlying nucleotide sequences. And that this really informed this notion of human beings as fixed and
Mm-hmm.
stable and separate in some ways from the fluctuations of their environment. But, then we embarked on this incredible international project to map the Human Genome Project. And we discovered, much to our surprise, that we had essentially the same amount of protein coding genes as a guppy
So funny.
or a pig, and really less than a grape plant, what I learned later.
Yeah.
About, 22,300 or around there genes. And this was very perplexing because we make hundreds of thousands of proteins. And yes, I think we learned a lot, from this project, and we learned that certainly that some genes predispose us to certain diseases, you know, famously sort of the BRCA gene, for example. It's, turned off, it's a tumor suppressor gene. So it can contribute to a higher likelihood of developing breast cancer, for example. But I think the real takeaway here was that it's actually not the fixed sequences, the but it's actually the relationship that we have to our environment that changes how those genes express. And then this idea gave birth to this emerging field of epigenetics, that we are not stable, fixed people, but we are always changing in relationship to our environment. And this is also true for neuroplasticity. We used to think that our brains were essentially fixed, right, at age 25, and it was a slow decline from there.
Yeah.
Or even in the world of microbiome, that's always changing and turning over, that we are really these impermanent beings, and that to be alive is actually process and not product. So this, epigenetics became a very trendy thing to discuss and to talk about. But then, for me, I had a lot of curiosity to understand the underlying mechanisms of why genes express in certain ways, what turns a gene off and what turns a gene on, et cetera. And I think there's this again is it's very new science, but for example, there is a whole world of epinutrition, which that
Mm-hmm.
essentially genes will express themselves differently in relation to certain nutrient inputs, for example, or stress. Constant chronic negative stress may influence the way a gene expresses. And often this is done through this process of hypermethylation. With this is like a little lollipop looking carbon and some hydrogens on there that essentially attach to the cytosine part of the gene. And that will, in some cases, turn a gene off. So a gene will not express itself in the way that it normally would. And so I think this is really quite fascinating, both from a physiological perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective, right? So, I write about this a bit in the book, but the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, sitting under the Bodhi tree, had this revelation that everything in the universe, including the human organism, was impermanent, right? That was always
Mhm.
constructing and destructing in relationship to its environment. In fact, the Buddha had this wonderful, wonderful metaphorical image of the universe called Indra's net, that essentially all of the universe was this massive cobweb that extended forever and ever. And each of us is a crystalline diamond at the at the juncture of each one of those webs, reflecting every single other crystalline diamond. And this was a very, very beautiful and
Beautiful. Beautiful.
poetic way of understanding our interdependence as human beings with our environment. And in a way, I think foreshadowed, the science of epigenetics.
Oh, I agree. And I love how you've explained that. And that just brings me to what you talk about. You have four basic underlying principles in helping people to understand what type of stress they're functioning in and to get and help them to understand that there's a good version of stress, as you talk about being eustress, which is a term that we've used for many years. And you have four principles that underlie the whole concept of helping us to balance our stress, to get into good stress and make the best of it. And you've just covered the one, which is the interdependence. You also talk about impermanence and the age of agency and balance. I wonder if we can talk about, if you could talk about each of those as well, the other three. So you've talked a little bit about interdependence with the epigenetics and the methylation, and I love that. So let's talk about impermanence, which you also started referring to with the Buddha
Mhm.
statement. So if you want to just talk a little bit more about impermanence, interdependence, the age of agency, and balance as your underlying principles, I'd love you to also, when you're answering talking about those, you have at the your title and your subtitle is the health benefits of doing hard things, and I'd love us to to talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so I found myself very, very sick about 5 years ago. I was diagnosed with diabetes. I had leaky gut, but moreover,
Mm.
day to day, I felt chronic fatigue, brain fog, irritability, kind of the inability to concentrate, the need to kind of check my phone every 5 minutes. I was much heavier. I was about 210 pounds with that kind
Wow.
of dad bod. So I had that, inner tube of adiposity around the middle. And as my children love to point out, I had the what is clinically known as gynecomastia, but as what they called man boobs. So there were plenty of insults to my vanity, but there was also just the experience of not being thriving, not being in a thriving state. And this was very much anchored in my I guess my story that I continually told myself about myself. I was a very chubby kid moving around the world, always kind of trying to fit into new schools and new cliques of friends and new languages, etc. And I really became a perpetual people pleaser. And the story I told myself kind of about myself was, I'll never be good enough. I'm just this kind of chubby
Mm.
kid that will never change. And, my fate was written kind of in the stars of my genetics. And so, in order to really change my health journey, I really had to change the story that I was telling myself about myself. And I think a lot of people can relate to that,
Mm.
particularly, and this is a grand generalization, but particularly women can become people pleasers. And this is very detrimental to psychological and physiological health. So the first kind of aspect of my health transformation was really understanding that change is not only possible, but change is the only thing that is actually happening. And of course, this, harkens back to that idea of impermanence that is very central to Buddhism. And this idea that we are not stable reliable selves really in some ways violates our instincts because, I get up in the morning and I traipse into the bathroom and I look at myself and I, flex whatever biceps I have. And like, there's Jeff, he's pretty much looks
Yeah.
exactly the same as he looked yesterday and he has more or
Mm-hmm.
less the same beliefs. So this notion that we feel fixed is underwritten by this physical and psychological continuity that we feel about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so this often underscores the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. But even the briefest look at human physiology, if you open up the hood, what you actually discover is that we are 7 octillion atoms
Mm-hmm.
forged in the crucible of some supernova 8 billion years ago that have assembled in Caroline and in Jeff and in everybody listening. And those atoms are experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions per second. To anyone
Mind blowing.
listening, it's crazy. To anyone listening to this podcast, you are literally not the same person that you were when the podcast started.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a
Exactly.
little scary, right? On some level, but it's
Yeah.
also very, very empowering because if all you are is process and not product, then disease is also process. And you have a degree of agency over your behavior and in your environment such that you can be moving along this continuum of health towards wholeness, that is the process of healing, or towards disease and disconnection, and that is the process of ailing. So waking up to your own impermanence is incredibly empowering. So
Mm-hmm.
there's the idea of
Beautiful.
impermanence.
I love it.
Interdependence is very related, and we talked about it already a bit. Of course, humans don't make their own oxygen, right? We rely on
Exactly.
plants to do that. Plants don't make their own carbon dioxide. They rely, on humans, and so that is a very, very prosaic, I guess, example of
Yeah.
interdependence with our outside world. But we know this, by dint of our experience, kind of day to day, when we walk. When we go outside and take a walk, we walk at about 3 miles per hour on flat ground. But, if we were to walk up a hill, we walk slower. If we walk in sand, even slower than that. If we walked in the ocean, even slower than that. And the point here that I'm making is that you cannot separate your own behavior and function from the behavior and function of your environment. They are
Mm-hmm.
one thing. And again, this violates our sense of self identity because we often associate ourselves with this kind of locus of consciousness, like crouching somewhere behind the eyes,
Yeah.
looking out at the external world as if it is something separate. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but it isn't,
Mm-mm. Not at all.
and sometimes I really think about the greatest example of that is, the microbiome, for example. We
Mm-hmm.
have 39 trillion prokaryotes living in us and on us, and
Yep.
increasingly we're finding them in every organ, but largely, nestled down in the den of our colons. And those are turning over and changing all the time. And every embrace and every door handle and every food that we put in our mouth changes their constitution. I mean, we are more bacterial in some ways than we are human. And and so we live again in this interdependent, mutually interdependent kind of holobiont with
Mm-hmm.
every input in our environment. And again, to really come to that realization is both a little bit scary, but very, very empowering because, again, you have the agency to adopt certain protocols and behaviors and modify your environment for greater health and wellness. And so, again, these are some of the sort of philosophical
Beautiful.
principles. And then I'll say the last bit of this is this concept of balance. So again, this has its etiology in Buddhism The philosophy of Buddhism is the middle way, or Madhyamaka. Originally, that was sort of avoiding the extremes of both hedonism and asceticism. But really, when you look at it in terms of human physiology, what you find is that health really can be defined by one single concept, and that is balance. And in human
Mm-hmm.
physiology, we call that homeostasis. And it really is quite incredible how the body is engineered to find balance, kind of dynamic homeostasis. You see it almost everywhere you look. You know, our circadian rhythm is characterized by this hormonal balance between cortisol and melatonin, right? Our neurotransmitters, there are excitatory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurotransmitters. And you need to find that right balance between glutamate, for example, and GABA.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have to find that right hormonal balance between ghrelin and leptin and insulin and glucagon. You have to find the right pH balance. So you're in that perfect little dynamic zone around 7.35, 7.4, et cetera. And when we swim with nature's current, our body is really good at finding that balance. But modernity tends to create the conditions to put us into states of imbalance. And so if you have agency, and you know that you can change and that you change in relationship to your environment, then you
Mm-hmm.
should be doing everything that you can to reify greater balance in your life. And the ironic thing is that in order to enhance the body's capability to achieve homeostasis, you actually have to push the edges of your discomfort. And this is where good stress comes into play.
Beautifully explained. I love that. Well, let's take this to a very practical level, even though you
Mhm.
started doing that. And let's talk about in your second part of your book, you have a lot of you start moving into how to achieve this balance between good and bad stress, or to keep yourself in good stress and to using the hard things because that's how we get there. And you have created these great tables, and I'm going to specifically talk about the one I know you can't see so clearly, everyone, but basically there's these little gray blocks that Jeff has in his book, and they call the body in balance. And in the second part of the book, he has a few of these, and it's fascinating to. It's a great way of looking at how to bring all the principles you've just spoken about together in terms of impermanence, interdependence, the age of agency or the age agency and balance. And so I'd love to take this a little deeper. You've already referenced them briefly, but let's talk about this first one from which is on pages 96 through I think it's 102. I wanted to touch on things like growth and repair, anabolism versus catabolism, all those, the growth, mitosis, hypertrophy, hyperplasia. Now, there's a lot of words I've just thrown out, but based on the philosophy that you've just provided, can you define, and I can prompt you, define these and give people an understanding to show them what this means? So, with our mind, we are going to make this decision to, like you said yourself, we make this decision to either stay in chronic stress and live with the rattlesnake, or to go into the acute stress, and the rattlesnake moves on and we move up on the path and we restore back to balance. So the good stress, so the hard stuff happens, and we can either stay stuck in the hard stuff and wish it went away, or do things that we think will suppress it, but it doesn't really go away until we've dealt with it. So you can't just pretend the snake's not there or whatever. You've got to actually face the hard stuff and work through
Mhm.
it. So in other words, to keep that, how do we're going to, when we do this, when we achieve those four principles, what does that look like and what's happening in our body as some examples? So that's kind of how I wanted to pitch this section of of your interview. So keeping the body, the mind, brain, and body in a great balance. We've got to get our mind into the position where we can actually get this mindset where we can actually do the things that are going to help us take advantage of the hard things, and with the guidance in our minds of impermanence and the agency and the interdependence, we can do these things. So this table I see as a way of helping people understand the impact of doing that. So I'm setting you up to explain this concept with some practical examples. So let's do this by you defining the growth repair concept and then giving some sort of practical example or some sort of story that explains it. And then we'll work through each of the as many as we can in the time we have together of those to just show people that this really does impact. Because I think sometimes people hear, okay, yes, I've got to get my stress under control. We know that everyone's telling us, but you see that there's a psychoneurobiological impact, your mind, brain, body connection, which is the field that I move in and work in. You identify that so beautifully. So when you get your mind doing these things, when you face the hard things and get into good stress, there is going to be shift and change within our body. Does that make sense, Jeff? Does that set you up to handle this? Does that set you up
Totally.
well enough? Do you understand what to do?
Perfectly. Perfectly. Yeah. Thank you
Excellent.
for that. Thank you for that setup.
So let's start with growth and repair, or however you want to dive into this section.
Yeah. So our bodies, like all of nature, are engineered, as we were talking about, for balance. So, you know, every winter promises a springtime, right? But in modern times, we particularly as it relates to growth and repair, we so sanctify and celebrate growth almost at every turn in our society. So yes, this is true with like our GDP or the top line of your business or the size of your house, the bigger the better. But what happens there is that we actually don't value and take into account the importance of restoration and repair. And so in modern society, we have, for example, a surfeit of shelf stable, nutrient deficient calories at our beck and call. I mean, on a whim, I could just use an app and order up any kind of food stuff that would essentially be at my front door by the time this interview ended, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so, what happens then in modern society, particularly when we can eat our feelings because there's so many calories available, is that we are in a constant state of growth at the expense of repair. And so you can see this obviously in obesity rates, for example. Unfortunately, the United States has an obesity rate about 44, 45%, but this is not at all confined to the United States. This is a global issue. I can name about 25, 30 countries that hover around 40% obesity rate. So this is just one reflection of constant growth at the expense of repair. And so, from a more kind of physiological pathway perspective, for example, there are a lot of different pathways within a human body. Some are anabolic, so they're growth oriented, and some are catabolic, so they're repair oriented. When we're feeding our body constant calories all the time, we're only in those anabolic pathways. So some of those anabolic pathways, for example, are like mTOR, like mammalian target of rapamycin. It is a growth pathway. It's not negative at all. In fact, we need that pathway to build, for muscle hypertrophy, et cetera. But when we're always in growth mode, what we don't get is the yin to that yang. So we don't get the activation of the AMP kinase pathway, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a repair and restoration pathway that's associated with autophagy, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
autophagy is the breakdown of these senescent or dysfunctional proteins into their amino acid building blocks, such that our body can then upcycle them into functional ones again. And so again, this is the tenuous balance that people should be trying to instantiate in their life between growth, repair, anabolic pathways, catabolic pathways like mTOR or AMPK. And so, in order to do that, in order to reify that balance, we actually need to align ourselves with the Paleolithic conditions in which we evolved. So,
Mm-hmm.
in this particular case, I recommend a fasting protocol in order to essentially activate some of those repair pathways. Because this is what kind of calorie paucity does. It activates, AMPK. It sort of senses a nutrient deprivation state, and it says like, okay, great, I'm going to move into repair mode. And this was built in to the way we lived across hundreds of thousands of years, because in the winter time there would be less calories available. But now we've essentially, from a calorie perspective, eliminated winter. Winter never comes.
Yeah.
And so, once you kind of understand these basic concepts, then you can adopt, these good stress protocols in order to find that balance. I mean, we tend to vilify fat, for example, in our society, but fat was actually, or the storage and warehousing of fat was actually an adaptive advantage on the Serengeti, right? It was totally normal and quite beneficial for your loincloth to get a little tight, right, in the late summer or early fall, because we knew that winter's fallow was just around the corner. And that paucity of calories not only kept us lean, but it stimulated all of these catabolic and repair pathways that we just talked about. And now, in the absence of that Paleolithic stress, we need to deliberately self impose it in order to realign the way we live with our engineering.
Beautiful. I love that. Realign the way we live with our engineering. And we're not. We're kind of going against that in a lot of our things. Now you've spoken about fasting, you've spoken about food, you've given those examples. Let's talk about mental health. Let's talk about the
Mhm.
mind. Let's talk about how this sort of, because stress is very much how we as humans respond to things going on in our environment. You gave the example of how we can just automatically very quickly order that food and feed our stress kind of thing, and it'll be all kinds of things that will definitely not create the balance we need, or work with our engineering. It'll work against our engineering. Let's talk a little bit about, if you can, what are your feelings on how this impacts our mental health, and tips would you give in terms of your four principles and mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think mindset in some ways sits above every single other protocol, because
I agree.
every experience of what it is like to be human is filtered through the prism of our mind. And so,
Beautiful.
how can we put our thumb on the practices and modalities that can once again bring us back to center, to emotionally regulate, to find a degree of emotional homeostasis, if you will?
Mm-hmm.
Because we live in an era in which your time and attention, and I don't mean just yours, Caroline, I mean
No, no,
everybody's.
everyone. Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone's time and attention has essentially been productized and commodified and
Mm-hmm.
essentially bought and sold. This is the attention economy, or the persuasion economy in which we live. And in order for that to happen, news media and social media essentially leverages, algorithmically preferenced sensationalism and hyperbole to essentially tickle your human negativity bias and put you in a state of constant chronic stress or outrage or fear or anger. And what we need to do is take back control and agency of our own mind, so we don't get led down, these dark corridors of chronic stress. So there's, many different ways to do that. And I think that there are somatic practices and physiological practices and protocols that help us to emotionally regulate and move back to center. And then there's more what I might call spiritual ones. So certainly meditation and conscious breath work are two that are at the very, very top of my list, and part of my daily regimen. For me, I have a what I call a single pointedness of mind meditation practice. And, I call it a good stress because in this day and age, it actually feels really hard and difficult to sit on your ass and do nothing.
I
um,
know.
and
The
and
productivity age.
correct. And to and to always return your focus on a single point of attention. So that's really the practice. And that point of attention could be your breath. It could be what is known as a drishti or a kasina, a singular gaze point. It could be a mantra, sort of a phrase that you repeat over and over again. Some people even use these mala beads and they just, roll them between their thumb and their forefinger. But this practice of meditation should not be confused with the cessation of thoughts. Actually, thoughts will naturally, of course, arise in consciousness moment to moment. But the real opportunity here for growth and the ability to enhance your emotional regulatory capabilities is your capacity to move from that thought or that distraction or that feeling or that emotion that bubbles up and watch it, witness it, see it disappear, and then move back to your point of attention. Move back to your breath. Move back to that gaze point. And that simple, simple practice will allow you to emotionally regulate, not just when you're sitting on your meditation cushion, but it will punctuate or spill over into the other parts of your life. When you're in traffic or when you're in a very stressful conversation or when somebody insults you or hurls some sort of ad hominem at you, you can find that space to then use that practice to move back to center. I mean, I often combine like a conscious breath work practice with other good stressors. So, for example, I'm an ice plunger, and I can't believe I'm saying that because I absolutely abhor the cold. And I think most people listening abhor the cold. But if you go back and you examine our Paleolithic or hunter-gatherer life, we were subject to fluctuations in temperature, and it often got very, very cold. And our body has an adaptive response to being very cold. It engages in this process of thermogenesis where you heat your body back up, and that's very adaptive for your metabolic function. It's also produces a lot of protracted dopamine, which is can be great, but also to more of your point, it increases your emotional resilience. So when I get into an ice plunge, for example, what happens? Well, I have a very natural involuntary bottom up reaction to that. It's like I have a big gasp and then, my heart rate and my respiratory rate again increase. My epinephrine is like coursing through my veins. I feel it kind of coming up into my carotid arteries. I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack. And then right at that moment, there is a space to apply top down conscious pressure on top of involuntary bottom up response. And you can do that through conscious breath work is a one very, very good tool where you can do an inhale and then a nice significant hold and then an exhale. And that will bring, again, conscious pressure, conscious on top of that bottom up response. You can also, I think, there's other approaches to this, which is really just leveraging your neo-mammalian rational brain to take back agency or take control back over kind of your more amygdala hijacked brain and realize I'm in cold water. I'm going to be absolutely fine. I'm going to breathe. And then, and I'm going to get to the other side of this, even though that it's very, very uncomfortable. And so, these practices of breath work in combination with cold, for example, will once again punctuate or spill into your quotidian life such that then you have enhanced your capability to move back to center, to balance between that sympathetic nervous system and that parasympathetic system.
Beautifully explained. I actually, as you're talking, I'm smiling because we have moved to Cleveland and it's snowing like crazy here and it's minus 11. It feels like minus 19 or something today. And we go out and take the dogs out and go for a walk and get freezing. And it just like in between working and it just refreshes yourself. And then I have my gym built onto my studio, and I have a sauna in there. So
There you
you
go.
can do the whole, and it's so great. And so those are great physical things that one can do to give you that power of agency and recognition that you can control your body, which is then so encouraging that you can then face the issue that you're dealing with. So whatever it is, these practices I'm hearing you say, and what I believe we say the same thing, is that these practices that you practice on a physical level, and from the cold to the sauna to the eating to the fasting, all these things, those are helping you to recognize the power of agency you have with your messy mind to control your wise mind to control the messy mind, which is why we call this podcast cleaning up your mental mess. So thank you for
Yeah.
explaining all of that. I love how you explain it, and there's so much more in the book, and the book is called the health benefits of doing hard things, good stress, and there's so much in here to really help people. Jeff, just to wrap up, I'd love you to, this is always a hard challenge, and I know you've probably been asked this before, but what would you say is the wisest piece of advice of all? You've interviewed many people, you've spent many years researching this and applying it, you help so many people with your master classes. What would you say is the wisest one piece of advice that you would give people if they just starting off in this or just trying to get their life into a better place? What is the wisest thing you would say?
Yeah, I think we always associate health with downward spirals, but I just want everybody to know that is listening that upward spirals in health are just as possible and available to you. And really, you have so much agency in order to find ways to reify those upward spirals. And it doesn't take long. The body is dying to heal. And once you get on one of those upward trajectories, the momentum is just an unbelievable experience to be on. So this is what I want people to know is that upward spirals in health are available to you.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much. Jeff, where can people learn more about you and get hold of your book?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on. I so enjoy
Yes.
connecting with you, and I'm very, very grateful that you
Likewise,
spent time with the book. It's very kind of you to be so rigorous.
of course.
You can find the book at goodstress.com. I was able to scoop up that URL.
Love it.
And yeah, I'm on Instagram at Jeff Krasno. But if you really want to learn from the masters, I run a platform called Commune. Many of our colleagues and friends are on that platform with master classes. And this book is really a distillation of the brilliant people I've been able to talk with, like yourself, and others that I've been able to work with.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. Thank you, Jeff, for your time. And it's been wonderful and enlightening and exciting and hopeful. So thank you.
Thank you.